I want to talk to John about consciousness. That's what I want to talk. I want to talk about consciousness.
Go for
that
it.
That was intense. All right, hi John. What would you like to? This is Shannon and Matt.
How are you?
Hi, John.
What would you like to talk about?
I'm happy that you're on, Shannon, and because I think you have some input on this.
Okay.
I'd like to share with you another notion of God or the soul or consciousness. They're all the same thing to me. I want to ask you, is it a fact that the brain sees and hears?
No. Is it a fact that the brain sees and hears? Depends on what you mean by that. I'm assuming that you're... Okay. Are you going to let me answer the question that you just asked me? I'm assuming that where you're attempting to go is that there's a mind-body problem. And so if I'm saying there's something that it is like to be matter with regards to a brain, and therefore when you say the brain sees and hears, are you talking about the brain physically, or are you talking about the self? And I would have what I think is, I'm exploring the philosophy of it a little bit more, but probably like a monist position with regards to that. So I would say that yes, it would be a fact that the brain sees and hears, because I see our conscious experience of ourselves as being synonymous with brain states.
Okay, how does a brain, if you imagine what a brain is, it's a lump of matter.
I can imagine quite well what a brain is.
Great. How does it see, hear, taste, and smell?
Which one do you want to start with? Do you want to start with olfactory, visual? Like which perceptual cognition system do you want to start with?
The brain itself. Because the brain, would you agree the brain is made out of brain cells?
No. No. Well, I mean, if you're talking about cells that construct a brain, then yeah, I guess they're each individual cells of the brain.
I need to interrupt for 1 second.
Okay.
The crew should probably go ahead and put Shannon up in a one shot.
You good, Matt? Okay.
I'm good, actually. This is going to be fun.
Good. Okay. So I want to get back to your other question though, John. You said like, how does the brain process either vision or olfactory senses or taste? So do you want the answers to those questions? Because I could start with the visual system. It's actually really interesting. We could talk about that if you'd like. Did you want to start with vision?
Let's just skip the eyes and the ears. Let's skip the eyes and the ears and just go straight to the brain. What in the brain is, there's an image in my brain. I'm looking at an apple. What in my brain is seeing that apple? The brain cells?
Okay, so when you're looking at an apple, the light that bounces off the apple hits the back of your eye, and there's rods and cones on the back of your eye on your retina. And they have a photosensitive protein. That photosensitive protein changes its shape and constitution slightly based on the wavelength that hits it. It travels through your optic nerve, across the optic chiasm, goes through the midbrain structures and into the occipital lobe, which is at the back of your brain. Once it hits the occipital lobe receives that change in constitution of the proteins that are on your cones and rods that are in your brain. And it recognizes them by comparing them against by some midbrain structures like the hypothalamus. It'll look at your memory. It'll go through some reticular formations that are in your brainstem, and then ultimately the thalamus, and then up to the prefrontal cortex, so that it can compare things that have previously been perceived with a contextual realization of that mental state, so that you will have a visual experience. Now, if when you're saying that an image appears in my brain, there's not like an apple, there's not like a picture of an apple on the back of your brain. But what we can do if you're looking at an apple is we can measure the effect on your retina against the activity in your brain. And without knowing, for example, that you're looking at an apple, we can tell you that we know that you're looking at an apple by looking at the activation network. So it seems to me that like I get that that's not necessarily what you're asking, but that's how that visual system, like on a super high level, works. What this all seems to kind of boil down to for you probably is that there is a mind-body problem. So why is it that there is something that it is like to be matter, and inarguably for us, that matter that we would be referencing would have to be the brain. There's demonstrable evidence that anything that's resembling an experience has to take place there, which is why we're talking about brains. Otherwise, we'd be talking about our fingertips, right? Like I can remove my fingertips and still have experiences, but if I can't remove I can't, like if I did even a minor injection to the reticular formation that sits in the brainstem underneath my thalamus, I would no longer have conscious experiences. That's just a fact. So that's why we're discussing the brain. Now, if you want to talk about why there is a mind-body problem, that's an interesting philosophical conversation that God doesn't answer any better than science answers right now. It's just a problem that everybody has. So is that what you're attempting to do by demonstrating that mental states aren't the same as brain matter, or are we both kind of wasting your time right now?
No, well, two things. No, I don't really want to talk about the mind-body problem like that. I'd rather say, is it consciousness itself doing the perceiving, or is it the brain cells that are doing the perceiving?
What do you mean by is it consciousness itself?
Brain cells, right?
The brain is made of, so like it is a brain, it is made of cells. So the cells that it is made of are definitionally brain cells, but there are varying types of cells. So there's soma, which is, sorry, they're all the same? You didn't just say they're all the same.
No, they're all similar. They all have cytoplasm, they all have RNA, they all have DNA, right? All the cells, they're different variations of the cells, but they're all cells, right? They all have...
Well, I mean,
right?
So do you know what the difference is between like white matter and gray matter in the brain, for example? Like it would all constitute cells, like everything at a cellular level, especially if you're talking about a living cell, of course, it's going to have cytoplasm and stuff, right? Like I get that. But I think you may be not understanding the difference between like what a neuron is and what white matter in the brain is and what other, because there's other components of the brain that don't consist of soma, cell body, from neurons, but are in fact like axons and dendrites that are extending from those neurons constituting the white matter. And they function in incredibly different ways. They do very different things. So I'm unsure what your question is. Like if you're looking at a
okay,
I'm not sure what your point is, other than it seems to be that you're getting at the mind-body problem, but not maybe understanding that that's what you're trying to get at.
I'm addressing the consciousness versus... Is consciousness a perceiver, or is it the brain a perceiver? Now,
consciousness. So what kind of? So I'm sorry to keep stopping you, but I feel as though we're going to go down too many rabbit trails if I allow you to keep going much further past your actual question. So when you're saying is consciousness as a perceiver, are you some sort of substance dualist, or do you think that there's something outside of the brain that's perceiving stuff that interacts with the brain somehow? Is that what you think?
I would say that the consciousness is the soul, but we don't have to call it that if it's a trigger word. I could just say is consciousness a being.
I'm not triggered by the word the soul. It's not a trigger word. I'm very, very desperately attempting to kind of discern what your understanding is of the brain at all, so that I can figure out what your argument even is outside of it just being the mind-body problem.
Yeah, because sorry, but since I laughed, I figured I'd go ahead and jump back in here.
Okay.
Basically, John's entire concern is what is consciousness and where does it come from? What is the observer? And so yes, he's advocating for mind-body dualism because what he thinks the answer to consciousness is the soul. But the problem is that's like saying what is the explanation for electricity, and you say electricity, because all you're doing is using a different word or the same word or whatever word you want to point to this. And so while we haven't solved and don't understand everything about consciousness, what we do know is that everything that's ever been attributed to the soul, like I would be interested in what John's definition of the soul is, because everything that's ever been attributed to the soul that has been identifiable is a function of the brain. Memory, identity, preferences, things like that. There's nothing about a soul that has been proven to exist or be true, which is not a function of the brain. What's left?
Consciousness is the soul.
Okay, well, you can assert that all day long. Congratulations. All you've done is substituted a word. You haven't done anything to edify or explain or expand our understanding of consciousness. You just prefer a different word.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. We don't have to use the word soul at all. But I'm trying to figure out what in a cell organelle. Is it the ribosome that does the perceiving? What in the brain is doing the perceiving? It is an organ made of cells.
In your brain, I'm not sure that it's working.
John, I really want to get through to you right now that you are just talking about the mind-body problem. You are just talking about why it is that there is anything that it is like to be matter, right? So that is, you keep telling me that's not what you're doing. And I'm certain that's what it is. And you and I would both acknowledge that there is a mind-body problem. Why is there something that it's like to be matter? Now, you maybe approach it differently than I do. And there's approaches to solving that problem that I drastically disagree with. For example, substance dualism. I drastically disagree with substance dualism. And one of the reasons that I do comes back to those cell membranes that we were talking about. When we have neurons in our brain, those neurons fire to release neurotransmitters so that we can have any kind of experience at all, right? So that we can move, so that we can see, so that we can think, so we can do anything. And that cell membrane, in order for it to fire, has to have a specific constitution of sodium and potassium ions on either side of it. And then it has to have the mitochondria inside that cell, inside that neuronal cell, produce a chemical called ATP, and that ATP opens the channel so that those sodium and potassium ions can transfer back and forth across that cell membrane in order for that neuron to fire. Now, if you're going to be somebody who's like a substance dualist, then you would have to explain to me how that substance, that external substance, acts upon the brain in order to get that constitution of sodium and potassium ions to exist as it is, stimulate a mitochondria in order to produce ATP, open that channel to have that action potential. And I don't think that's possible. Now, there are things like panpsychism that's kind of interesting, or pantheism, that are kind of interesting ways that people look at solving this problem from a philosophical standpoint. None of them have answered that problem. So you telling me that the mind-body problem exists doesn't negate my perspective, nor does it even attempt to try to understand my perspective, because I acknowledge that that's a problem. No, so I'm not sure what you're even trying to get at.
I mean, so first, I have a couple quick questions, John. Do you know what an emergent property is?
Yeah, it's a claim that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain.
No, John. No, John, I didn't mention consciousness at all. I said, do you know what an emergent property is?
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
Yeah. So like, there's nothing about a water molecule that is wet. Wetness is a property that emerges from water molecules interacting, right?
So you're using an analogy. That's an analogy. I don't care about
John, if you would quit trying to rush to the fucking finish line and just answer the question, we could do this so much easier.
I've heard it before.
Well, then why did you fucking call? Why are you wasting our time? If you're not willing to do this, because my next question for you was,
I'm barely
John, I've been silent for ages. Would you let me finish my fucking question? Are you going to let me finish my question, John?
I'm barely talking as it is.
John, what's your explanation for how consciousness works?
Good question.
It's its own source. And I think it's an entity, not something we have, it's something we are. And I call it consciousness centrism, where reality moves around consciousness. I don't believe a brain can sense or perceive. It's just.
Okay, I've now muted you because you don't think a brain can sense or perceive. When I'm asking you how it works, I don't want you to tell me what you think happens. I want you to tell me what justification you have. When I say, how does consciousness work? You think you have a solution to consciousness, something that philosophers and scientists haven't really sorted out, but you think you have one. I don't just want you to tell me what it is. I want you to tell me why. And if your why is just, you don't believe a brain can do this, then we're hanging up, because what you don't believe is not a justification for your position. So how do you think consciousness works, and what is your reason for thinking that?
I believe consciousness is its own source, and I deduce that by comparing the models that science has. So we have different models. We can compare the models and say which one's the better model. I think that consciousness is actually pure fucking magic, but we can deduce what it's sourced from. I don't know what consciousness is, what it is, but I know it's could be its own source, or it could be sourced from the brain. And so
okay,
far,
John,
Shannon or
John,
you haven't proven that
John,
it's sourced from the brain.
John, I'm interrupting you again, and I'm sorry, but I have to, because my co-host sat here for ages explaining to you how a brain works. And when I ask you how consciousness works, you tell me it might be this, it might be this. I think it's a source because I don't believe science is model. If you don't believe science, that's your problem. I'm going to stick with the science. And if you can't come up with a way to demonstrate that what you think is true about consciousness is actually true, why should anybody listen to you? We have someone here who's studied the science, who's giving you the answers that are backed up by facts, and you are spouting opinions and how you don't trust the science. Why should anybody care what you think about consciousness?
Is it my turn to speak?
Ask that again, I dare you.
No, I'm just trying. No, I wasn't being rude. I was actually asking if it's my turn to speak because I'm trying to be polite. But I don't think that you're open-minded enough to be progressive about talking about consciousness and making it
I'm not open-minded enough. You're the one sitting here denying science, and you're going to say that I'm not open-minded enough. That's a great defense. I'm glad we backed you into a corner where your only remaining defense is to say that we are too stupid or not open-minded enough. We just can't understand.
I'm trying to make progress.
You're not trying to make progress. You are trying to avoid progress because I've asked you to explain consciousness and you have nothing.
You can't. It's pure fucking magic, but we can identify the
no, wait, your explanation is that it's just magic?
Why do we continue wasting time on someone who wants to know what the science is? We tell him the science and then he says it's pure fucking magic. Well, magic isn't real, John.
Well, the source of consciousness may be a mystery, okay? Maybe mystery is a better term than magic. But
I agree.
Identify the source of consciousness. I'm trying to make progress with you, Matt.
No, you're not.
You and I to come. Yes, I am.
No, you're not.
Please listen to me.
See, I can do this over and over again. No, you're not. Can you give something that is an explanation? Can you give an explanation?
I can try to.
Can you give an explanation for what consciousness is, or are you just pulling shit out of your ass?
I'm saying, what is the source of consciousness?
I can try to answer that one. Like, there's an interesting theory that Mark Soms has recently put out, who's a neuroscientist who actually studied psychoanalytics, and it has to do with the setup of the reticular formation in the brainstem. He came to it by studying specifically people who had a form of encephalitis, which meant that their frontal lobes were essentially non-existent. So they only had like cerebral, brainstem, and midbrain sort of thalamic structures. But they were still resonating that they were having some sort of experience through facial expressions, and even though they couldn't effectively communicate. And because consciousness, we think of consciousness as a more high level. We think of it more so as like logic centers and rationality, and less on an emotional level. He has a theory that's very, very intriguing that that has to do with the reticular formation being this sort of seed of consciousness, where from an emotional perspective, and that our rational processes are built on top of it. And some of the reasons that he has for supporting it are, we have nociceptors like throughout our skin, for example. And those nociceptors are a form of neuron that exists in our body, and they go through the reticular formation before they enter our conscious experience. So it works almost like a gateway. So it can have a gateway to perception entering the conscious experience. And one of the reasons that it kind of shuts down almost 80% of those sensations that our neurons are having before we get any conscious experience of them is because it's deemed unnecessary by the reticular formation to give us that conscious experience. So the reticular formation, and it's one of the only things in the brain that if you damage it to any degree, you will lose the ability to even have conscious experiences. Not just like something about who you are will change. Like if you mess around with your frontal lobe, like you can fundamentally change who you are, but you'll still have conscious experiences. So that can't have anything to do with consciousness. Same with split brain, you'll still have sort of conscious experiences. But this, when you drill down, does make sense from a parsimonious standpoint too, because it would make sense that any sort of vertebrate animals that have this sort of brainstem structure would also have conscious experience, which would have a benefit to survival, because they would be able to not only take in perception and react to it sort of like in a visceral reflexive way, but actually be able to have slightly higher order processings with the reticular formation working as a gateway.
So you've identified the source of consciousness.
It's a posit. It's an interesting posit that's worth exploring. It's a new theory. His book's called The Hidden Spring.
Let me ask a really easy question, John. We don't have an explanation for consciousness, and you don't have an explanation for consciousness. So, what should we
identify the source?
John, do you not know what "so" means? I'm in mid fucking sentence. So, if neither us nor you have an explanation for consciousness, what's the point of this discussion?
I never claimed to having I said the source of consciousness. What is the source? We can identify the source, not in it.
John,
why couldn't it be the reticular formation that I just mentioned?
What is the point of your conversation about consciousness? How does this relate to a God?
Well, okay, we could call consciousness God.
Why?
If you want
what end? Like, for what reason, though? It's just semantics. Like, I don't understand how this is progressing. Like, isn't what I just said kind of interesting? Doesn't that make some degree of sense? Like,
he doesn't know what you said. John has no comprehension of anything you said because he doesn't trust the science. He thinks it's all magic, and he wants to recall consciousness God, which doesn't get us any closer to proving that a God exists or anything else. John is a monumental waste of my time.
You're not progressing.
Oh, John. Okay, this is going in circles.
John.
I don't
the anti-science guy gets to tell me I'm not progressing. Go away.
Ad hominem attack. You're nothing.
No. It's not a fallacy, dumbass. It would be, if I said you were wrong because you're stupid, that would be an ad hominem fallacy. But an ad hominem attack isn't a fallacy. If I'm just identifying that you started by saying that I can't progress, and then you're the one who can't actually progress, that's not an ad hominem fallacy. Yes, I will. What do you want me to call you? I will call you anything you want. What would you like me to call you?
No. FaceTime me, you and me, at your house, and we can make some progress and not just put on a show for the audience, because you're putting on a show for the audience. I'm looking for...
Okay, so now you're accusing me of not honestly defending the propositions. You're never getting anywhere near my house, guaranteed. Okay. And you're not going to have a conversation with me because you don't care about science and you are not willing to talk about the subject. No, you don't. Shannon's been sitting here explaining science to you, and your response is that it's fucking magic.
Consciousness.
I don't know why Shannon hasn't hung up on you yet, so I'm taking over.
I'm gonna
Goodbye.
Okay,
I already did it.
Okay.
I'm not going to sit here and be told that I'm being dishonest and putting on a show for the audience when the caller is saying it's pure fucking magic. Well, I agree that we don't have a current good explanation for consciousness, but there are a number of different models that have been proposed. And all of the models that have been proposed that are likely to lead us somewhere are the ones that Shannon was trying to tell you about, the ones that are within the bounds of science. Because when the scientists sit around and go, gosh, it's just pure fucking magic, we should just quit.
That's like,
that's how they end up like John.
I don't even understand what just happened.
It was John's way of saying that we are too closed-minded to see the soul that he sees.
But that doesn't make any sense, though, because he's saying there is a mind-body problem. And I'm like, yeah, no, I totally get it. But there's lots of ways to address it. Some of them I do and don't agree with. Here's some of the things that I think are promising things to explore from a neuroscience perspective, though I do understand that it's still an issue.
Yeah.
And then he says, yeah, well, you're not listening. It's magic?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how people that I wanted to stay quiet on there, but I could see that. So this is the subject that Shannon's passionate about, and she just gave everybody on the planet a great education on a couple of the many different models that try to address the problem of consciousness. And we called it on from the get-go. John's not interested in that. John wants to dismiss it all in order to put his God in there, and then has the audacity to suggest that it's an ad hominem for me after he tells me that I'm not open-minded. I am open-minded to evidence, not blah, 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 soul.
Yeah, I think it's one of my favorite things to talk about. I don't have an answer for the mind-body problem. If anybody did, they'd be handed their Nobel Prize pretty much fucking immediately, right? But just that doesn't mean that you could just assert then my position's correct. Like, we both have the same problem, but my position is correct. Why is your position correct? Because literal magic.
Yeah. And I think it's hilarious that John acknowledges that he doesn't accept the science, and yet he thinks that he could sit down and have a conversation and convince me. You're not going to convince me without evidence supported by science, period. I mean, we're talking about what's going on in a brain. He doesn't think the brain can perceive. He thinks there's a magic thing that inhabits the brain. And here's the thing. We already know that's almost certainly not true. We know it from splitting corpus callosum and ending up with two individuals communicating independently. We know that from other brain damage things where someone's personality is reset, where their memories are reset, where they can't form new memories. What does that say? That there's a soul that does all this, but when you fuck with the brain, the soul all of a sudden changes? The soul can't be. Does that mean if I get hit on the head and I no longer remember my past, am I an atheist? Am I a Christian? Am I saved? Am I not saved? What if before I got hit on the head, I was a Bible-believing heterosexual male praising Jesus, and after I get on in the head, all of a sudden now I'm gay and worshiping Satan? Did my soul actually change when we hit my brain? There's nothing about a soul, which is what I said at the beginning, that's been proposed and has been demonstrated to be real, that is not an identifiable function of the brain.
Yeah,
and if you want to say there's a soul, you have to show that there's something beyond that.
Yeah, the soul just complicates matters to me, or at least most of the conceptualizations of the soul that have been shown to me or proposed to me in dialogues just either are a synonym for consciousness, in which case, call it whatever you want. I don't care. That doesn't like that we're arguing about semantics at that point, or it's some sort of like external conceptualization of the soul, in which case it doesn't seem plausible to me. But anyway, there's other people waiting to call. I'm sorry that went off the rails. If anybody is listening and would like to call and have an actual conversation about consciousness that isn't whatever that was, I would love to the next time I'm on. It's my favorite. That and morals are my favorite thing to discuss, but it always ends up like that, which is disappointing.